"Who let the janitor sit down?" Judge Howard Mercer didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply turned from his conversation, looked across the ballroom, and said it the way a man says something that has already been decided. Calvin's hands had barely touched the keys. Mercer crossed the floor in 8 steps, measured unhurried, reached down and closed the piano lid. Hard. The sound cracked through the room like a gavel. Then he leaned in close. "Look at me when I'm talking to you. Those are black hands. Stained hands. You smell like bleach and floor wax, and you are sitting at a $200,000 instrument in a room full of people who actually belong here. Get up!" Calvin didn't move fast enough. Mercer gripped his collar and pulled the seam tore at the shoulder and shoved him off the bench. Calvin's white cane hit the marble. The hollow roll of it across the floor was the only sound in the room. Mercer looked down at him, then turned to his circle with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The help gets confused sometimes. They see a bench and forget they're not guests. Laughter from the inner circle. Short. Performative." Then Mercer glanced back at Calvin, still on the floor, one hand pressing the cold marble, and said it quietly, almost gently, the way cruelty sounds when it's completely comfortable with itself. "You want to play piano, boy? Go find one at the shelter. This one has my name on it." 300 people. Not one of them moved. What none of them knew, what Judge Howard Mercer would spend the rest of his life wishing he had known, was exactly who he had just put on that floor. Stay with this story. The ending will change the way you look at every powerful room you ever walk into. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe the people this world steps over deserve to be seen, subscribe. We find them every week. The alarm didn't wake Calvin Reeves at 5 in the morning. The alarm was just confirmation. He was already awake before it sounded, lying still in the dark that had been his world for 6 years, listening to the building breathe, the pipes in the walls, a dog on the first floor turning in its sleep, a car on the street below starting its engine, idling, then pulling away into silence. Calvin knew that car. A 2009 Civic with a belt that slipped in cold weather. He had never seen it. He knew it the way a blind man knows everything, through repetition, through sound, through the particular texture of absence that forms when something familiar is gone. He sat up, found his cane leaning against the nightstand exactly where he'd placed it the night before. He always placed it in the same spot. Not because he was careful by habit, because in a life where the world had gone dark, precision was how you kept yourself from being afraid. 17 steps from bed to kitchen. Left hand trailing the wall. Fingertips reading the map, smooth drywall. Then the door frame. Then the spot 3 inches from the corner where the wallpaper Rose had chosen was beginning to peel at the edge. He touched it every morning. He never fixed it. Some things you leave the way the person you loved left them. The coffee was instant. Second shelf right side behind the salt. The Braille label on the jar was wearing smooth. He would reapply it this weekend. Rose had taught him that habit back when the darkness was still a narrowing rather than an ending, back when the doctors were still using words like manageable and adaptive strategies. She had labeled every jar, every bottle, every drawer in the apartment with the same steady hand she used for everything, building him a map for a life she already knew she wouldn't be part of much longer. Cancer. 5 years ago. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning. Calvin woke up, and the apartment sounded different. Heavier, emptier, like a room where a clock has been stopped. Before coffee, before anything, he went to the dresser. His fingers found the framed photograph, the glass cool under his palms. He traced it the same way every morning, not to see it, but to confirm. A younger Calvin eyes, still bright, still seeing standing at a piano in a room with high ceilings and marble floors. Beside him, a man in a dark suit. The rotunda of a city hall, half blurred in the background. Anyone who had been in that room on that night would have recognized it immediately. Calvin set the photograph down, made his coffee, stood at the window that showed him nothing, and drank it slowly. The career had been real. That was the thing he had to remind himself on mornings when the apartment felt like it was shrinking. It had been real. He'd earned his scholarship to the Peabody Conservatory at 19 full ride, no conditions, the kind of offer that makes a family cry at the kitchen table, in a way that has nothing to do with sadness. His debut recital at 29 drew 600 people, and a review in the Baltimore Sun that used the word transcendent without apology. By his mid-30s, he was performing at civic events across the country, inauguration ceremonies, anniversary galas, evenings, where cities dressed themselves up and believed for a few hours in their own better versions. 4 mayors had requested him by name. Not once, multiple times across multiple years. Mayor Marcus Bell in Atlanta had called him personally the week before his second inauguration. "I want the same piece you played last time," he'd said. "The one that made my wife cry." Calvin had known exactly which piece without asking. The composition was called Rose. He had written it for his wife before they were even married, a melody built around the shape of a particular laugh, a particular silence, a particular way she had of standing in a doorway like she was deciding whether to stay. He played it at their wedding. He played it at 4 inaugural ceremonies. He played it at 47 semaines. At a NATO Cultural Summit dinner in Brussels, in a room full of foreign ministers and diplomats who had heard every great pianist alive. They rose without instruction. Several, Calvin was told afterward, stood before they understood why. Then, at 53, the diagnosis: retinitis pigmentosa, degenerative, irreversible. The world closed in the way a curtain closes not all at once, but steadily. By 56, it was done. Total darkness. The industry's response was a particular kind of silence. Not cruel, worse than cruel. Indifferent. Agents stopped returning calls. Venues stopped extending invitations. Promoters who had once called him personally now had assistants send emails that grew shorter and further apart, and then stopped entirely. One manager was honest enough to say it plainly: "Calvin, they want the inspiration angle, and you won't give it to them." He wouldn't. He had refused every request to sit on a morning show couch and let a host pat his hand and call him brave. He was not brave. He was a musician. Bravery had nothing to do with it. So Calvin Reeves disappeared. No farewell concert, no press release, just silence, and then eventually a janitor's badge. Under his bed sat a wooden box, latched slightly rusted at the hinges. Inside, 4 handwritten letters from 4 mayors, a Carnegie Hall program from 1994, a photograph from Brussels. He hadn't opened it in 3 years. He ironed his uniform every morning. Crease deliberate collar flat badge pinned exactly 2 inches below the left shoulder. Rose had once said, without intending it as a lesson, "You can tell everything about a man by the things no one else notices." He noticed, even now, especially now. The bus to the federal courthouse took 45 minutes. Driver Carl said, "Morning, Mr. Reeves," when he boarded. On some days, those were the first words spoken to Calvin since the morning before. When Carl said, "Have the good one, Mr. Reeves," and the doors opened, Calvin stepped onto the sidewalk and turned toward the building he had cleaned for 7 years. He felt, without being able to name it, a change in the current of the morning, the particular tension, that precedes something not good, not bad, but significant, above him without his knowing. Two workers in jumpsuits were hanging a banner across the courthouse facade. The Justice and Arts Foundation. Annual Gala tonight. The U.S. Federal Courthouse in Baltimore had been standing since 1932, and in that time, it had been many things. A place where careers ended, where families fractured, where the full weight of federal law came to rest on individual human lives. The marble floors had absorbed nearly a century of footsteps. Judges, attorneys, defendants who walked in carrying hope and walked out without it, reporters and law clerks and witnesses and bailiffs. And Calvin Reeves, who had been mopping those floors for 7 years. He knew this building the way a surgeon knows an instrument. The lobby 42 steps from the entrance to the security checkpoint, the floor slightly uneven before the third pillar on the left, a ridge in the marble barely visible enough to catch a wheeled cart if you weren't paying attention. The east corridor longer, cooler, footsteps coming back from the walls with a slight delay that said the ceiling was high. The judge's private restroom on the 4th floor, always the last stop on his route, always the room that needed the most attention, always cleaned with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything else. 9 years of floor work, 7 here, 2 at a hotel across the harbor before this. 9 years of saying, "Excuse me," to men in suits who did not break stride. 9 years of being looked through. He had made his peace with it. Not bitterness, not resignation, just a clear-eyed understanding of the room. He did his work. He went home. He did not expect the building to know his name. Deshaun Briggs had not made peace with anything. He was 38 years old, built like a linebacker in his second career, with a voice that belonged in a Sunday morning pulpit and eyes that missed nothing. 4 years at the courthouse, and from his second week on, he had made it his quiet practice to carry Calvin's supply cart to the service elevator at the start of every shift. "You don't have to do that," Calvin had said the first time. "I know I don't." They had not revisited the subject in 3 years. Deshaun was the closest thing Calvin had to a friend. Not because Deshaun had decided to be kind to the blind man, but because he had concluded after approximately 6 weeks of working beside Calvin that Calvin was the most interesting person in the building, including every federal judge on every floor. He could not have explained the feeling precisely. It was something in the economy of Calvin's movement, the precision of his speech, the quality of his silences, a sense that somewhere inside this quiet man in a gray uniform, there was a room Calvin had once lived in that Deshaun had never seen and could not find the door to. 2 years ago, that door had opened by accident. Deshaun was pulling a late shift. A visiting dignitary's security detail had tracked mud through the east lobby, and the cleanup ran past midnight. He was walking back from the supply closet at 12:40 when he heard it. Music. From behind the closed door of the basement break room. He stopped in the hallway. The music was unlike anything that had a right to exist in a room with plastic chairs, a water-stained ceiling tile, and a vending machine out of order since October. It was rich and full and layered, the kind of sound that seems to take up more space than the room it inhabits. Deshaun stood in the hallway. He did not move. He cracked the door. Calvin sat at the old upright piano in the corner, a donated instrument slightly out of tune, the kind of piano that had spent too many years in too many church basements to remember what it had originally been built for. His eyes were closed, though Deshaun knew by now that with Calvin, that detail was irrelevant. His hands moved across the keys with the certainty of water finding its course through stone, not searching, not reaching, just arriving note after note at exactly where they needed to be. Deshaun sat down on the hallway floor, back against the wall, legs stretched out. He did not move for 25 minutes. When Calvin finally stopped and lifted his hands, Deshaun rose quietly, pulled the door to walk to the stairwell at the end of the corridor, and sat on the top step in the dark for 10 more minutes. He was not thinking about anything in particular. That was unusual for him. The next morning, when Calvin boarded the elevator, Deshawn fell into step beside him and asked without preamble, "Who are you, man? For real?" Calvin smiled, the particular smile Deshawn had come to recognize, the one that answered nothing, and said everything. "I'm the guy who mops the lobby, Deshawn. Same as yesterday." Deshawn had let it go. He had been carrying that unanswered question for 2 years, turning it over when things were quiet, setting it down when they got busy picking it back up again. Some questions have weight that doesn't diminish with time. By mid-morning, the courthouse lobby had been dressed for the evening. Catering staff moved through the corridors with equipment carts. The ballroom on the second floor, a formal event space used twice a year for official functions, was being prepared with the efficiency of people who had done this before and understood exactly what the evening required. Inside the ballroom, a Steinway Model D grand piano sat beneath a focused spotlight. 9 feet of handcrafted spruce and ebony built in Hamburg tuned that afternoon. On its side, a brass plate engraved with 8 words, "Judge Howard Mercer, Patron of the Arts." Calvin passed the ballroom door at 10:15, supply cart beside him, cane ahead. The door was propped open for a catering delivery. He always slowed near this room during setup. He never went in. Today, he slowed, paused for 3 full seconds, and kept moving. He told himself it was a choice. It was beginning to feel more like a delay. Judge Howard Mercer arrived at precisely 6:30. Not 6:28, not 6:32, 6:30, as he had arrived at every engagement of consequence for the past 30 years, early enough to establish presence, late enough to ensure the room was already populated when he entered it. Timing, he had always believed, was its own form of argument. A man who arrived exactly when he said he would was a man who understood that the world ran on his schedule, not the other way around. The Lincoln Town car pulled to the courthouse's private south entrance. 2 law clerks stood at the door. A catering supervisor waited with a revised menu for last-minute approval. A young woman from the event staff had been standing in the November cold for 12 minutes, having been told that Judge Mercer preferred to be greeted personally upon arrival. He stepped out of the car and acknowledged none of them. This was not rudeness, or rather, it was not experienced by Mercer as rudeness. He was a precise man, and precision required clarity about categories. These people had a function. Acknowledgement was a social transaction, and social transactions implied reciprocity. Mercer did not do reciprocity with people whose role was to serve. In his understanding of the world, that was not contempt. That was simply order. He was 65 years old, with silver hair cut close, and a posture that had never across 3 decades on the federal bench learned what the word casual meant. His suit was custom charcoal wool, double-breasted, made by a Georgetown tailor who charged accordingly and was worth every dollar. His watch, a Rolex Submariner, caught the building's entrance lights as he walked through the door and threw them back. His shoes were handmade Italian leather. They had never been worn in rain. Patricia Mercer stepped out of the car behind him. 61, handsome in the way that speaks of a younger beauty carefully maintained. She wore a deep navy dress, and a single strand of pearls she touched at regular intervals, the gesture of a woman who has learned not to be fully comfortable with the things she is wearing. She walked 2 steps behind her husband, not because he asked, because she had learned over 23 years of marriage that walking beside him meant a conversation later in the car delivered in a voice that never rose above a murmur and was therefore impossible to argue against. She had stopped arguing 7 years ago. She was not certain Howard had noticed. He moved through the ballroom, the way a federal judge moves through any space he has authority, over which, in Mercer's understanding, was every space he entered. Conversations lowered as he passed. A sommelier adjusted course mid-stride. A young woman from the catering team straightened her posture so abruptly she nearly lost the champagne tray in her hands. Mercer registered none of these small adjustments. They were simply the order of things. The Justice and Arts Foundation Gala was on paper among Baltimore's most distinguished philanthropic events. 7 years running. $2.3 million raised for music programs in underserved Maryland schools. Tonight's guest list included 3 sitting U.S. senators, 4 mayors from major American cities, 2 federal appeals court judges, and representatives from every significant arts institution in the region. By every objective measure, it was a worthy event in service of a beautiful cause. What it actually was, what it had always been, was a stage with 1 performer and 300 audience members. Near the performance platform, a young woman stood with a violin case on her back. Jasmine Carter, 24 years old, a black musician from East Baltimore whose talent had earned her features in 3 separate regional publications in the past 2 years. This was her first significant invitation, a chance to perform a short opening set before the headline act, the kind of evening that can alter the shape of a career. She had prepared for 3 weeks. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she was holding it together the way young people hold things together when everything depends on the next few hours. When Mercer passed her, she stepped forward, extended her hand. "Judge Mercer, it is truly an honor to be—" He spoke past her, without slowing, directing his words to the assistant at his right. "Tell me the real talent has checked in." Jasmine's hand hung in the air for 2 full seconds. Then she lowered it carefully, quietly. The way you lower something you didn't realize could simply be left there. At the Steinway, Mercer placed both hands flat on the piano's case, looked at the instrument for a long moment, and then touched the brass plate with 2 fingers. Slowly. The way a judge lays a hand on a piece of evidence he has already decided is conclusive. Judge. Howard Mercer, patron of the arts. He had donated the Steinway 3 years ago, not because he loved music he did not play, had never played, had never felt the particular pull that leads a person to sit at an instrument and reach for something beyond language. He had donated it because he needed his name attached to something beautiful in a room full of powerful people. The Steinway was not to him an instrument. It was a statement, and the statement, like all of Mercer's statements, was about the distance between himself and everyone else. He turned to his inner circle. 3 men in identical dark suits who laughed before his punchlines landed and agreed with positions he hadn't yet finished stating. "You know what separates this room from most rooms." He looked out at the arriving guests. "Everyone here understands where they belong. That's rarer than people realize." The 3 men nodded. One chuckled slightly too loud. 40 feet away, through the ballroom's propped service door, Calvin Reeves had stopped pushing his mop. The piano tuner had struck one final chord moments before packing his case, a single G major, open and resonant, floating out through the gap in the door and into the service corridor, like something that had been waiting a long time to find the right pair of ears. Calvin's cane hovered an inch above the floor. His head turned toward the sound. His left hand hanging at his side twitched once. Not a decision. Something older than decisions. The scheduled pianist was a man named Marcus Pierce. 41 years old, based in New York, represented by one of the most prestigious concert agencies on the East Coast. His fee for the evening was $18,000, confirmed in writing 4 months ago, and again 3 weeks before the event. He had performed at Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, and 2 European concert houses in the past 18 months. He was by every professional measure exactly the kind of headline act that a gala of this caliber required. At 7:45, he had not arrived. Beth Hollins was standing behind the stage curtain with a phone to her ear and a face the color of the white tablecloths in the room below her. She was 32, 5 years into event management, and she had handled every variety of crisis this job could produce. She had rerouted an entire floral arrangement on the day of a senator's retirement dinner. She had located a replacement keynote speaker in 40 minutes when the original developed food poisoning. She had managed blackouts, vendor collapses, and one occasion involving a live string quartet and a burst overhead pipe. She had never had a headline act simply not appear. Pierce's agent, when she finally reached him, spoke without apology. A weather system had grounded LaGuardia for 3 hours. Pierce was at the gate. He would not make Baltimore tonight. There was no understudy, no contingency, no plan B. There was, the agent added, as if the information were relevant, very little anyone could have done. Beth thanked him in a voice that indicated otherwise. She lowered her phone and looked at the stage. The Steinway sat under its spotlight, immaculate, absolute, indifferent to everything happening around it. The ballroom beyond the curtain held 300 guests who had paid $2,000 a seat for an evening that included a performance. The performance slot had come and gone. It was now 8:15. She began working through her backup list. The first pianist was booked. The second, unreachable. The third answered, asked the venue name, asked who was hosting, and declined without explanation, in a tone suggesting the explanation would have reflected poorly on multiple people. The fourth had a family emergency. The fifth could arrive in 90 minutes, which solved nothing. By 8:20, the list was exhausted. Mercer arrived at her shoulder before she heard him coming. A change in air pressure. A quality of stillness that preceded him the way silence follows a gavel. "Tell me," he said, voice measured and low, "what I am supposed to say to 4 mayors who flew into Baltimore tonight." His flight was grounded the weather system over New York. "I did not ask about the weather." Beth opened her mouth. Mercer had already turned away. He gave instructions the way other people breathed automatically, without pausing for compliance, without appearing to consider the possibility of failure. The expectation of results was embedded in the grammar of every sentence he uttered. She had been working this event for 3 years, and it had never once changed. Jasmine Carter had been watching from the edge of the platform. She had arrived early, stayed quiet, absorbed the dismissal without visible response, and spent the past hour standing very still and holding everything together. She crossed to where Beth stood, violin case on her back, and spoke quietly. "I have a full set prepared. 45 minutes minimum. I could play while you sort this out." Beth looked at her, looked toward where Mercer held court at the center of a cluster of men whose collective attention orbited him like a closed system. She thought about asking. She calculated the variables. She thought about the conversation in the Lincoln town car on the way home if anything went wrong tonight. "Let me check," she said. She didn't check. At 8:22, Calvin Reeves clocked out at the basement-level time-card station, same as every Thursday. Badge folded into his jacket pocket cane, retrieved from beside the supply closet jacket buttoned. The service exit to the loading dock alley was his standard route. Carl's bus ran every 22 minutes on Thursday evenings. If he left now, he would make the 8:41. He moved through the service corridor. His cane swept ahead of him, reading the floor, the walls, the particular geography of a route so familiar his feet knew it without instruction. He was thinking about the instant coffee on the second shelf, the radiator that would be ticking when he got home, the 17 steps from the door to the kitchen, the photograph on his dresser that he would touch before anything else tomorrow morning. The corridor ran alongside the ballroom's east wall. Most evenings that wall was simply a wall, a surface, to pass alongside on the way to somewhere else. Tonight, the ballroom service door was propped open. A catering cart had jammed in the frame, and no one had come to fix it. Through that gap, sound moved into the corridor. Not music. The tuner had packed his case hours ago. What came through the door was something the tuner had left behind, a residual presence, a G major chord struck and released, and somehow still occupying the air of the hallway, the way certain sounds do not fully leave the spaces that held them. Open, bright. The kind of sound that does not ask permission to be heard, that does not concern itself with timing or context, or whether the listener is ready. Calvin stopped walking. His cane hovered an inch above the floor. His head turned toward the sound the way a compass needle finds magnetic north. Not a choice, not a deliberation. A fact about the world. His left hand at his side moved once. Barely. The faintest curl of the fingers, a motion so small that a person watching would not have called it significant. But it was not a small thing. It was a reflex carried in the muscle and the bone, undimmed by 15 years of silence, waiting with perfect patience for exactly this moment. The service exit was 24 steps ahead. Carl's bus was 16 minutes away. Calvin did not move toward the exit. He moved through the service corridor slowly. Not cautiously slowly, with intention. His cane found the wall, then the doorframe, then the threshold between the corridor and the ballroom. He stepped through. He had cleaned this room 340 times across 7 years. He knew it the way a person knows a space inhabited entirely in darkness, not visually but physically in the body, in the accumulated memory of motion. The ceiling was high, because sound climbed upward and came back soft. The tables were arranged in the standard gala configuration, 12 rounds of 25, the first row beginning 40 feet from the stage. His feet remembered the spacing. The chair legs, the table bases, the slight variation in floor texture, where the carpet runner ended and the marble began. He navigated through the edge of the room, the cane sweeping ahead of him, the crowd redistributing around his path without anyone consciously making space. Nobody saw him. He was a man in a gray janitor's uniform moving through a ballroom of people in black tie, and in that particular context, a gray uniform rendered a man functionally invisible. He felt the stage before he reached it, a shift in ambient sound. The particular drop in noise that happens when open space ends and a platform begins. His cane found the first step, then the second, then the third. The Steinway was 6 feet to his left. He felt it the way you feel a fireplace before you see the flames, something large and resonant and alive, occupying more presence than its physical dimensions could account for. He found the bench, sat. His hands came forward and rested on the keys. For 3 seconds, there was only the piano. Then a hand closed around his collar from behind, not a tap, not a touch, a clamp, and yanked him backward off the bench with a force that tore the seam at his left shoulder. His cane hit the marble. The hollow sound of it rolling across the floor was for 2 full seconds, the only sound in the room. Calvin's knees found the floor, both palms pressed flat against the cold marble. He could feel through his hands the vibration of 300 people going absolutely collectively still. Mercer's voice came from above him, unhurried, carrying without effort. "Get your black hands off my instrument." He was not shouting. He was doing something that required no volume at all, speaking with the certainty of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where his words carried the force of law, in a tone that assumed compliance the way gravity assumes objects will fall. "Look at these hands." A pause, deliberate, allowing the room to look. Black hands, cracked hands, hands that smell like bleach and floor wax. These are not pianist's hands. These are mop rags. And you are sitting at a $200,000 instrument dressed in a janitor's uniform with your name badge still on. He let that sit for a moment. I don't know what they teach where you're from, but where I come from, you stand when a judge walks in. You certainly don't sit at his property. The laughter from his inner circle arrived on cue, short, performative, requiring an audience to function. It got the audience it needed. Nobody in that room said a word. Nobody moved. 300 people adjusted the volume of their breathing and waited. At table 1, Mayor Marcus Bell had placed both hands flat on the white tablecloth. Mayor Patricia Osei glanced at his face, then returned her eyes to the stage. Mayor Daniel Reyes had set down his fork. Mayor Donna Warren's jaw was tight enough to show at the back of her cheek. None of them spoke. Calvin remained on the floor, cold marble through the knees of his uniform, his cane somewhere to his left, still moving, its sound growing smaller, with distance until it stopped against the leg of a table. Mercer looked down at him for a long moment, then turned to face the ballroom, adjusting his cufflink almost relaxed. Somebody get this man a mop. Light laughter wider this time, more people reaching for it as permission settled over the room. Then Mercer turned back and delivered the last line at a level just above conversational, the tone of a fact being confirmed rather than a cruelty being performed. Fine. You want to sit there that badly? Go ahead. Show this room what a blind black janitor can do with a Steinway. Give the mayor something to talk about on the flight home. He turned his back, completely. A man who has already moved on. Calvin stayed on the floor. Cold seeping through his palms, up through his wrists, into the place in his chest where something had been locked for a very long time. 2 months' rent overdue. The notice on the kitchen counter he hadn't opened, because he already knew the weight of a final warning. Rose's ring sold 4 months ago for groceries. The wooden box under his bed with its rusted hinges, unopened for 3 years. He thought about standing up and leaving. He knew exactly where the service exit was. He could be in the alley before the room had time to process it. Tomorrow, this would be nothing. A bad night? A story he would never tell. He thought about Rose, not about losing her, about who she had believed him to be on days when the industry had gone quiet and the darkness had closed in, and the apartment felt like it was contracting room by room. The steadiness in her voice when she said things she had no proof of, except her knowledge of him. Your hands were made for more than this, baby. Don't you forget. The marble was cold beneath his palms. He found his cane. He stood. He did not walk toward the exit. He walked back to his bench, sat down, placed his hands on the keys. The room, which had been very quiet, went absolutely still. Mercer spun around. Are you serious right now? Calvin's voice came out low, unhurried, without a single trace of performance. I heard you, Your Honor. Every word. But this piano didn't. The ballroom did not go quiet. It went still. There is a difference. Quiet is the absence of sound. Still is the absence of movement of breath, of the ordinary micro-motions that mark a room full of living people. This was still. Every person in it had become for a moment one single collective held breath. Waiters froze mid-step. A woman at the third table set her champagne glass down so carefully the stem made no sound against the cloth. The 4 mayors at table 1 had not moved. Mayor Marcus Bell was leaning slightly forward, both elbows on the table, watching the stage with an expression no one near him could read. Calvin's posture had changed. Not dramatically, a person not paying close attention might have missed it entirely. His shoulders dropped 1/2 an inch. His chin lifted. His spine straightened into a line that had nothing in common with the man who mopped these floors, and everything in common with a man who had sat at instruments like this one 1,000 times before. The adjustment was small. Its effect on the room was not. His left hand was visibly trembling. A fine, sustained tremor, not fear, but the particular weight of years pressing down on a single moment. 15 years since a piano of this quality. 15 years of silence, of empty mornings and instant coffee, and 17 steps from bed to kitchen of a life carefully and precisely maintained within its new and diminished dimensions. His body was remembering, and remembering when you have been away that long is not painless. He placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade, number 1 in G minor, entered the room like smoke, tentative, fragile, each note placed with the precision of a man testing ice he does not yet trust. The melody was there, but thin, stretched between hesitation and hope, as if the music itself was uncertain whether it had permission to exist in this room tonight. A man in the second row leaned toward his wife. "This is going to be painful to watch." She didn't answer. She was watching too carefully. Mercer folded his arms. The contempt resettled on his face with the ease of a familiar posture. He tilted his head slightly, the angle of a man watching something struggle already certain of the outcome. 8 bars in Calvin's right hand stumbled. A note arrived late. Then another. The tremor in his left hand spread. A passage that should have flowed landed in pieces, each fragment slightly misaligned with the one before it. In the service doorway, Deshaun Briggs stood gripping the frame with both hands, still in his uniform, not breathing. He had followed the sound from the lower corridor without consciously deciding to. He had heard Calvin play once before and had spent 2 years carrying an unanswered question. Now he watched and said nothing, because there were no words yet for what was happening. Then the thing that silenced the room more completely than any music. Calvin stopped. Both hands lifted off the keys and hovered an inch above the ivory. Motionless. The last note, an F unresolved aching toward somewhere it hadn't reached, hung suspended in the air of the ballroom. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. Mercer unfolded his arms, opened his mouth to speak, and Calvin's fingers came down. Full, not tentative, not careful, not thin. The Chopin broke from his hands like water through a dam that has been holding for 15 years, and it filled the room so completely that the room seemed to expand to accommodate it. His left hand drove the bass line with a force that traveled through the floor, up through the chair legs, into the bodies of the people sitting in the first 4 rows. A champagne flute rang in sympathetic resonance. A fork rattled against its plate. His right hand sang the melody with a clarity so sharp it felt like a clean line being drawn through the air. Not loud, not aggressive, but absolutely, immovably true. And in a room full of people who had spent 3 hours performing carefully calibrated versions of themselves, truth had a physical effect. The woman at the third table pressed one hand flat against her chest. She was not aware she was doing it. Mercer's arms dropped to his sides. He took 1 step backward, then another. He was not aware he was doing it either. Calvin's body was unrecognizable. The janitor was gone. The man at the Steinway was someone this room had never met, but understood immediately the way you understand a language you were raised hearing, even if you can no longer speak it fluently. The Chopin built toward its first climax. Cascading octaves across the full width of the keyboard, Calvin's arms sweeping in wide arcs, the bass notes now deep enough that the wine glasses on the nearest tables vibrated at their stems. A man in the back row rose from his chair, not to leave, but because sitting no longer felt like a neutral act. 2 people beside him followed. Then, without pause, without break, without surrendering a single beat to the transition, Calvin shifted. The Chopin dissolved. In its place came Gershwin's Rhapsody in blue, sliding in the way. A conversation changes languages mid-sentence, seamless, audacious, impossible to brace against. Jazz rhythms, syncopation notes bending and swinging and landing in unexpected places that somehow felt inevitable once they arrived. Jasmine Carter sat forward in her chair. Her lips parted. She was a trained musician, and she understood precisely what she was witnessing. Not a man playing two separate pieces, but a man speaking two languages with native fluency, switching between them, without accent, without hesitation, without the faintest cost to either. The technical demand of it was historic. The ease of it was something that had no category. A waiter near the kitchen door set his tray down on a table. Not because he should, because he had forgotten he was holding it. Deshawn let go of the door frame. His arms fell to his sides. His face was wet, and he had stopped noticing. Then the Gershwin began to soften at its edges, not ending, but yielding the way one color yields to the next in a sunset, without a moment you can point to and call the transition. And from within that yielding slowly, with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time, something entirely new began to rise. From within that yielding space, the new composition arrived on a single note, middle C, held for 2 full beats. Nothing else. Just that one note suspended in a room of 300 people who had collectively stopped knowing what to expect. Then a second note. A third. A melody so spare it almost wasn't a melody at all. It sounded less like a composed piece than like a memory reaching for language, like a word someone has been trying to recall for years that finally, without warning, surfaces whole. This was Rose. Calvin had written it before he and Rose were married in a rented apartment in East Baltimore, with a second-hand upright and a radiator that knocked in 4/4 time. He had written it not as a performance piece, but as a private thing, the musical shape of a specific laugh, a particular silence the way she stood in doorways as if deciding whether to stay. He had never intended it for public rooms. But it had grown over 20 years of marriage joy and loss, and the slow closing of the world into something too large to contain. He played it at their wedding. He played it at 4 inaugural ceremonies across America. He played it in Brussels for a room of foreign ministers who rose without instruction. He had not played it in 5 years. The melody gathered layers. Harmony folded in one voice on top of another, the way threads are added to cloth, individually thin, collectively strong. The simplicity deepened, a still pond revealing when you look long enough that it has no bottom. Then the dissonance arrived, a chord that refused to resolve, a passing tone that pressed against its neighbors. The warmth of the opening shifted, and what replaced it was something the room felt in the chest before it reached the mind. The specialist's voice explaining what degenerative meant, colors retreating from the edges of the world, faces softening into outlines, outlines dissolving into voices, voices into the final complete dark. The dissonance built, layers colliding, notes grinding against each other with enormous controlled force. Calvin's hands moved across the full range of the keyboard, the bass thundering now, the chandelier crystals above the stage beginning to tremble, not from volume, but from resonance, from a frequency that made the glass hum in recognition. A woman at table 7 had both hands pressed to her mouth. She did not know why she was crying. She did not know who Rose was. She did not need to. Grief speaks without introduction. It finds its audience in the dark. Then slowly, with the patience of something deciding to stop destroying itself, the fury began to soften, not disappear. Soften. The bass chords thinned. The dissonance unraveled thread by thread, and in its place, The original melody returned not as it had been, but as something older, carrying everything that had happened since its first statement. The darkness, the silence, the 7 years of marble floors and supply carts, and mourning Mr. Reeves from a bus driver who was kind enough to say a name. All of it folded in invisible but essential, the way experience changes a person without changing their outline. At table 1, Mayor Marcus Bell stood up. Not applause, not a reaction to the room. He rose the way a man rises when he recognizes something he believed was gone from the world permanently. He had been leaning forward for the past 4 minutes. Now he was on his feet, and his face carried the expression of a man confronting the full distance between where he is and where he should have been. He leaned toward Mayor Patricia Osei beside him and said barely above a whisper, "Patricia, that's Rose." She looked at him for 1 second. "I know," she said. "I know." Mayor Daniel Reyes was already standing. Mayor Donna Warren placed one hand on the white tablecloth and pushed herself upright deliberately, as if the action required her full attention, and deserved it. All 4 mayors on their feet, not prompted, not coordinated. The way 4 people stand when something commands it without asking. Margaret Tillman had not moved from her chair at table 4. She was 71 years old, a professor of music history at Juilliard for 38 years, a woman who had heard every significant pianist of the modern era and kept, since 1979, private notebooks recording the ones who made her understand why she had chosen this life. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on Calvin, and her expression had no name in the vocabulary of ordinary public events. She had known from the first 8 bars of the Chopin. She rose from her chair, now touched the arm of the woman beside her, and moved toward the stage microphone with the measured pace of someone who has something important to say and intends to say it correctly. The Steinway's final note, a single sustained G, faded from the ballroom, the way a candle burns down in still air. Not extinguished, diminishing. And then an absence that was not empty, but full of everything the music had placed there and left. Calvin lifted his hands from the keys, placed them in his lap, his head slightly bowed. His face was wet. For 6 full seconds, 300 people did not move, did not breathe, did not exist outside the boundaries of this room. Then the 4 mayors began to clap. Together, deliberate, each beat landing like a heartbeat restarting. Not because someone else started, because it had to start, and they were the ones who knew why. The room came apart at its seams. The ovation came from somewhere below decision. 300 people on their feet, simultaneously, not prompted by social obligation or following someone else's lead, but pulled upward by something that bypassed choice entirely. Hands coming together hard, voices breaking. The particular sound of a room full of people experiencing something they were not prepared for and will not, for the rest of their lives, forget. Jasmine Carter was standing on her chair with both arms raised above her head, tears running unchecked down her face, and she did not care who saw. 8 months ago, she had sat in her apartment with her violin case on the floor in front of her and thought seriously and for the first time about what her life would look like if she simply stopped. Tonight she understood with a physical clarity that she would not stop. Could not. The music had just told her so in a language that did not allow for argument. Deshaun Briggs walked out of the service doorway and into the ballroom for the first time. Still in his janitor uniform, a damp streak on his left sleeve where he'd wiped his face. He moved through the outer edge of the crowd until he was standing near the stage, and he watched Calvin sitting at the bench with his hands in his lap, and his head slightly bowed. And 2 years of carrying an unanswered question dissolved all at once into an answer so large he couldn't locate its edges. Margaret Tillman reached the microphone. She did not rush. The room adjusted to her pace without being directed to. When a woman who has spent nearly 4 decades at Juilliard moves toward a microphone in a room where something historic has just occurred, something in the collective understanding of the space makes way for her. The applause continued around her. Then gradually, it settled into silence. Her voice was steady, controlled. But underneath the control, something moved the way a deep current moves beneath still water. The man sitting at that piano is Calvin Reeves. She let that land fully before continuing. He is a graduate of the Peabody Conservatory. He performed at 4 consecutive mayoral inaugurations across this country, each time by personal request. His original composition, the piece you just heard, was performed at a NATO Cultural Summit dinner in Brussels before foreign ministers and heads of state. He played Rose at your inauguration, Mayor Bell. You stood then, too. She paused. The silence in the room had a quality that pressed against the walls. The man your host grabbed off this bench tonight and told to know his place has been cleaning this building's floors for 7 years. That is not Calvin Reeves's failure. It is ours. The room did not erupt. It cracked a sound that was part applause and part something older and less comfortable. The sound of 300 people confronting simultaneously the gap between who they believed themselves to be and what they had allowed to happen in this room. Mayor Marcus Bell walked to the stage. The other 3 mayors followed not in formation, but as individuals, each moving under their own weight, all arriving at the same place. Mayor Bell stopped at the edge of the platform. His voice carried without amplification. Calvin, the night you played Rose at my 2nd inauguration in Atlanta, I told my wife that it was the most beautiful music I had heard in my life. I said that then. A pause, deliberate and unhurried. I'm saying it again now, in front of every person in this room, because it is still true, and because some things need to be said out loud more than once. Mayor Osei placed her hand on Calvin's shoulder. Mayor Warren took his hand in both of hers and held it. Mayor Reyes stood at the end of the line without speaking, the particular presence of a man who understands that sometimes the statement is simply being there. Then Judge Howard Mercer walked toward the stage. He moved the way a man moves when every eye in the room is on him, and he is performing a composure he no longer has access to. Stiff. Mechanical. Each step placed with the excess care of someone compensating for something shifting underneath. He stopped in front of Calvin, cleared his throat. His voice arrived at a pitch slightly higher than his customary courtroom register. I wasn't aware. If I had known who you were, I never would have. Calvin turned his face toward the voice. Slowly. His expression was calm, not forgiving, not triumphant, not angry. Clear. The expression of a man who knows exactly what he is going to say and carries no uncertainty about saying it. Your Honor. He let the title sit between them for a moment. You have spent 30 years on that bench deciding who deserves a fair hearing. Fair. Tonight you decided who deserved to sit at a piano. I would simply like to know on what evidence did you rule. The room cracked again. Louder. More irreparable. Mercer stood with his mouth open, his apology undelivered, his sentence suspended, returned to him intact for him to examine alone. Jasmine Carter found Calvin at the edge of the stage. She was still trembling. She took his hand the way you take something that deserves to be held carefully, and said, I almost quit 8 months ago. I was this close to walking away from everything. Her voice broke once, then steadied. I'm not quitting anymore. Calvin's hand closed around hers. 2 words. Quiet. Certain. without a syllable of performance. "Don't dare!" Deshawn found him by sound. He stood beside Calvin the way he had stood beside him for 3 years steady without ceremony, and after a moment said, "Man, I was out there trying not to ugly cry in front of federal judges." The room laughed, warm and full and genuinely human. The kind of laughter that releases what has been pressing against the walls all evening. At 9:22, Judge Mercer and Patricia left through the East Side exit. No announcement. No farewell. Patricia walked 3 steps ahead of him. Not behind, ahead. In 23 years of marriage, she had never walked ahead of him. Mercer said nothing during the drive home. Neither did she. But the silence between them had changed in a way that both of them understood, and neither would name. It had acquired weight. And edges. And the specific quality of something that cannot be put back the way it was. A guest's phone video was posted to the internet on Sunday morning at 7:46. It was filmed from table 9, shaky in the opening seconds, then steadying. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. By Sunday evening, it had 9 million views. By Tuesday, 16 million. By Thursday, it was trending in 12 countries and had been covered by every major outlet from the Associated Press to outlets Calvin had never heard of in languages he couldn't name. The headline ran everywhere. In nearly every language with almost no variation, the blind black janitor and the judge's piano. The clip people shared most was not the climax. Not the thundering bass, not the cascading octaves, not the 4 mayors rising. It was 11 seconds near the beginning of Rose, Calvin's hands hovering above the keys, the room holding its breath, the last note of the Gershwin still dissolving, and then the first single note of the new composition arriving in the silence, like a voice calling a name. 11 seconds of nothing then everything. That clip alone reached 4.6 million shares by Wednesday afternoon. Margaret Tillman issued a public statement Monday morning on Juilliard letterhead. "Calvin Reeves is among the greatest living pianists in America. This is not a generous assessment. It is an accurate one. The fact that he has spent the past 7 years cleaning federal courthouse floors is not a footnote to his story. It is an indictment not of Calvin, but of every institution, every agent, and every room that looked at a blind black man and decided the story was finished. It was not finished. It has in fact just begun." Mayor Marcus Bell announced at a Thursday press conference in Atlanta that Calvin would perform at the city's 150th anniversary celebration at Centennial Olympic Park. Outdoor, free, open attendance, expected audience 40,000 people. The 4 mayors jointly submitted a formal nomination the following week, Calvin Reeves for the Presidential Medal of Arts. The letter was 2 pages long. Its final paragraph read, "We are nominating Calvin Reeves not because of what he overcame, but because of what he is. A musician of historic caliber. A man of complete integrity. And a reminder, which this country periodically requires, of what we forfeit when we confuse a person's circumstances with their worth." The Kennedy Center offered a full residency within 10 days. His first announced concert sold out in 9 minutes. Calvin accepted both offers on one condition: a fellowship, not a general arts fund, not a broad endowment, but a specific scholarship built for young musicians who had been told their gifts were inconvenient, their paths too complicated, their ambitions too much to accommodate, kids who had extended their hands and found them left in the air, kids who had almost quit. He named it the Rose Reeves Music Fellowship. "She always said my hands were made for more," he told the journalist who asked about the name. "She was right, but so are a lot of other hands that nobody's paying attention to. That's what this is for." Jasmine Carter was the first recipient. Judge Howard Mercer's Justice and Arts Foundation lost 4 of its 6 major corporate sponsors within 8 days of the gala. 3 board members submitted their resignations by email on the same Tuesday morning within 40 minutes of each other with no acknowledged coordination. Mercer's office released a formal statement carefully worded reviewed by 2 attorneys, constructed to perform accountability while limiting exposure. The internet read it in 15 seconds and returned to the original video. Apologies assembled by legal counsel do not stop the bleeding. They only slow it. The brass plate on the Steinway Judge Howard Mercer Patron of the Arts was removed by courthouse maintenance staff the following Wednesday at 11 in the morning. No memo was issued. No directive was sent. No one was asked. The staff simply arrived with the appropriate tools and did it. When asked later, no one recalled specifically who had decided. It just seemed like time seemed, one of them said. The morning after the Kennedy Center announcement, Calvin Reeves woke at 5 o'clock. The radiator ticked in its familiar pattern, 2 beats, a long hiss, silence, repeat. 17 steps from bed to kitchen. Left hand trailing the wall. Fingertips finding the door frame, the peeling edge of wallpaper, Rose had chosen the long, smooth run to the kitchen threshold. Coffee jar on the second shelf, right side behind the salt. The Braille label wearing smooth at one corner. Nothing had changed, everything had changed. He stood in the kitchen for a long time with his coffee cooling between his palms, listening to the building settle around him. The pipes, the upstairs neighbor's footsteps, a dog somewhere below. The sounds of a life that was small and specific and entirely his, and which had always been, despite everything, exactly enough to stand on. Then he did something he had not done in 3 years. He knelt beside the bed. Found the wooden box by touch, the smooth grain of the lid, the cold resistance of the latches, the slight give of rust at the hinges. He opened it. Inside 4 handwritten letters from 4 mayors. A Carnegie Hall program from 1994, the paper carrying the smell of preserved time. A photograph from Brussels. 3 decades of evidence, held in a box under a bed in East Baltimore, that he had always been exactly who he was. He touched each letter, each signature, not to read them, to confirm they were real. He sat at the kitchen table, cold coffee, ticking radiator. The apartment that had been for 5 years both the hardest and the most honest space he had ever inhabited. And for the first time since Rose died, Calvin Reeves smiled. Not for a room, not for a camera, not for anyone watching, just smiled the way a man smiles when he finally quietly allows himself to recognize something he has known for a long time. He whispered into the still apartment, barely sound, just breath shaped into words. I kept my hands clean, baby, just like you always said. The world did not hear that sentence. It was not meant for the world. Some words are not. They are meant for one person. And sometimes that person is no longer in the room, and you say them anyway because love does not require a listener. It only requires a voice willing to speak. There are people cleaning the floors of every important room in America right now, mopping the marble in the buildings where decisions about their futures are being made. Invisible by design, overlooked by habit, carrying inside them entire worlds that the room around them will never think to ask about. Dignity was never something a title could give you. It is something you carry quietly, through every room that tries to take it. If this story reached something real in you, share it. Not for the numbers. For the person in your life who has been overlooked and needs to be reminded that the world missed something, not them. And if you believe the people this world steps over deserve to be seen, subscribe. We find them every week. every single one.